the exposure triangle. So the exposure triangle is made up of the three elements of exposure: aperture, ISO, shutter speed, or time value. All exposures are comprised of these three elements, whether or not you're shooting in auto mode or in manual modes. The thing about auto modes, of course, is that you don't know how the camera is going to select the combination of aperture or shutter speed or ISO to create the image that you want to take. In manual modes, you can control aperture, shutter speed, or ISO to make sure that you're capturing the image just the way that you want to. This gives you a great deal of creativity. If we look at the triangle relationships, you'll see that when the ISO is constant, as you change your f-stop, your shutter speed will change, or vice versa. If I change my shutter speed, my f-stop will change to end up with the same exposure. In other words, f2.8 at 1/2000th of a second is the same exposure as f22 at a 30th of a second. If I keep my aperture or f-stop constant and I change my ISO, I can increase my shutter speed or decrease that shutter speed. So if I'm choose my f-stop of f2.8 and I'm at a 15th of a second at ISO 100, and I realize that's too slow for what I'm trying to capture, I need to change my ISO to give myself a higher shutter speed. Now the drawbacks to that, if we go back here and we look, is that ISO creates noise as you go up from 100 to 400 or 1600 or 6400, whatever your ISO may end up being. As you increase those numbers, your signal to noise ratio increases and you end up with pixelation and greater noise and less accuracy with your image. So you want to be careful when you're choosing your ISO to make sure that you choose a low enough ISO to realize your vision for your image and not just arbitrarily select a high ISO number. When you're selecting your shutter speed or time value number, you're looking at that because you either want to freeze action or you want to blur action. Again, your choice on whether or not you want to slow down water, for example, or capture fireworks, or just slow down running individuals so that you have a blurred effect. Same thing with aperture. When you're selecting your aperture, you're doing so that you can choose a depth of field. Do you want to have everything in focus or very little in focus? And so your choice will determine what your outcome is. So if we go back and we look at the relationships again, you realize that you're making decisions for that final product. So do you want to have a shallow depth of field? Do you need to have a fast shutter speed? Do you prefer slow shutter speed? All of these things will come into play as you choose your three elements: ISO, f-stop or aperture, or your shutter speed. When you're looking at your ISO, you're usually choosing a low ISO depending on your daylight, the amount of light that's available to you. So if it's 100 to 400 for sunny daylight sorts of conditions, or if you're on a tripod and you're shooting a landscape, ISO 100 to 160 is usually more than satisfactory and absolutely what you want to select. If you're choosing action or something where you're going to be needing to freeze the action, you want to choose something more in the realm of 400 to 1600, depending again on the light that's available to you. And you may need to go to much higher ISOs if you need a fast shutter speed and you're shooting indoors or at the ends of the day where it's quite dark outside or you're in a shady area. Again, choosing the right ISO will enable you to balance the noise with the speed which you need to freeze your motion. Here's a couple of examples. Here we have a blurred foreground where I'm shooting at f5.6 at 500th of a second. You can see that tulip on the left stands out versus the tulip on the right where I'm shooting that at f32 at 1/25th of a second. Now those exposures are virtually identical. 500th of a second and 5.6 with its larger opening is the same exposure of f32 with its small opening at a 25th of a second. Again, how do I want to show this image will determine whether or not I'm going to choose a shallow depth of field or a great depth of field. Here again, I have on the left a quarter second at f20, and you can see for the most part the tulips and the pansies are in focus to about, I would say, halfway through the image. And if we look at the one on the right at 1/80th of a second at f4.5, pretty much it's only the bottom quarter or less that's in focus. Those exposures are virtually identical. Quarter second at f20 is the same as 1/80th at 4.5. Again, you make the decision from a creativity perspective of how you want to show this field of flowers. When we look at blurring the action, if you look at the images on the left, you can see at 200th of a second, they're pretty well frozen. And as I make my way through to a 40th of a second at the end there, you can see their hands are blurred, the hair is blurring. It gives you a greater sense of movement. Is that what you want in your image? If so, then that's what you need to select. If we look at the image on the right, you can see the same sort of thing. At 100th of a second, you can see her body is relatively stable and clear, certainly in the face, but she's got a lot of movement in her dress. If we look at the bottom image, at 1/10th of a second, we've got a lot more blur, very little detail. Their faces are starting to blur. You can make them out, but you've got a lot more blur there. And if that's what you want, then that's what you need to select. And if we look at this example here, again, at a 60th of a second, we have a little bit of movement there in the dress, but at a 25th of a second, we have tremendous amount of movement, a much more dynamic shot, maybe not as good a composition, but a much more dynamic shot because of that slower shutter speed. So again, when you're looking at the exposure triangle and you're trying to determine what you want to do with your image, it should be based on what you envision that image to be. How creative do you want to be? Do you want to freeze that image so that you capture a moment in time? Do you want to blur that image to give it a sense of action or dynamics? Do you want to have a shallow or greater depth of field? What is it that you want to achieve with your image? And then set your exposure appropriately so that you minimize the noise and you maximize your creative endeavor. Thank you very much.